right, so let me just get ourselves started. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We will be discussing some of the blips and themes that are coming out of the next Thoughtworks Technology Radar Volume 23. And with us today, we have Erik Doernenburg and Scott Shaw. Both of these colleagues of mine are from members of the Thoughtworks Technology Advisory Board. And this is a group who actually write the technology radar. We're very fortunate to have them here with us today to give us some insights into some of the key blips and themes that are coming out of the next volume. Okay, and my name is Thao Dang. I will be the moderator for today. Just a little bit about myself. I am based in Singapore. I'm the head of technology for Southeast Asia. I've been at Thoughtworks for the last 9 years. I started out in Thoughtworks London as a developer, but moved to Singapore 6 years ago. And it's been a very great journey for me in Singapore. I've been the head of technology for Southeast Asia for the last 3 years, nearly 3 years. So on top of consulting with clients, I also help with all of the technical aspect of operation for the region, particularly in Singapore and Thailand. So during the session today, if you have any questions at all, please do send them in through the Q&A function here. I will be monitoring the questions coming through. If it is related to the topic at hand, then I will be voicing them out. Otherwise, we also have the Q&A session at the end of the webinar for you to raise any other questions that you may have. Cool. Next up, we have Erik. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Erik Doernenburg. I am also, like Thao, head of technology, just not for Singapore. I'm the head of technology for Thoughtworks in Germany, where we've been around for about 10 years. Interestingly, also, like Thao, I started in Thoughtworks London. That was in 2002, unbelievably 18 years ago. That's when I joined Thoughtworks. I've been working in different countries in Thoughtworks and have been part of the group that writes the radar pretty much from the beginning in around 2012. I've been involved in writing most of the 23 volumes that we will have soon of the radar. And yeah, like Thao, I work as a head of technology, do some of the coordination with the other regions, but also work strategically with some of our clients in the region. And I'm excited to be here, even though it is very early in Germany still.
Yes, thank you so much for waking up early for us. Cool, Scott.
Yeah, hi, I'm Scott Shaw. I'm the head of technology for Thoughtworks in Australia. Despite my American accent, I've lived in Australia for many years. I'm an Australian citizen, so I've done a lot of different things in Thoughtworks, general management, and worked in India and China in addition to Australia. But like Erik, I've been the head of technology here in Australia for some time. I divide my time. I've sort of spent some time helping to run the business, but I spend a lot of time with customers and do more strategic kind of technology consulting. And I love being part of this group that writes the radar. We have very lively discussions every 6 months, and we've been doing this for quite a while now.
Cool. Thank you so much, Scott and Erik. So I think let's move on to the next one. So before we get started with all of the, the meat and the interesting stuff that's part of this discussion today, I just want to give you a quick overview of the technology radar. So as Erik and Scott have mentioned, every 6 months, we have a very senior group of technologists getting together to talk about, some of the interesting things or technologies that we see in the last 6 months from all of our projects across the whole world in various different domains and tech stacks. And these technologies are what we call blips. And the blips are categorized into quadrants. Each quadrant is like a topic, a logical grouping of these blips. So you might have platform or framework and languages and so on. And then what the interesting thing about these blips is that they then are further classified into the rings. So you see the 4 rings across all quadrants. So in the center, you have the adopt ring, which is The ring that we think, all the blips within this ring are mature and have proven track records, from our experience from our project, and we would like to recommend for you to seriously consider using them. And then the next ring to that is the trial ring, which is the ring that contains the blips that we think are ready for use. We recommend for you to take a look at them, trial them out, and see if they're suitable for your project. And then beyond that, we have the assess ring, which are things that we think have quite good potential, but may still have a little way to prove themselves. And so therefore we would say, keep an eye on them, see how they progress, and then assess them for your project eventually. And then the final ring that you see on the most outer side is the hold ring. This is where we say that, we've had some experience using these blips, but we actually found that, it's not actually a good experience. So therefore, we are calling them out to warn you, to say that, there are potential issues around using this. It could be that they are not mature enough. It could be that they might be fundamentally flawed. So therefore, if you do decide to use them, please use them with caution. And then just about a quick overview about the blip themselves is that you'll see that each of the blip is surrounded by either an outer ring or a partial ring, or with nothing at all. So these just indicate whether or not it's a new blip or a blip that has moved, or there is no change at all. All right, so now that we have all of the mechanics sorted, let's get going to the interesting bit. So I'll hand over to Scott to talk about some of the blips.
We're going to talk about, I'm just going to talk about a few blips that follow a particular theme, and then we'll talk about the theme a little bit at the end of that. And the first blip I want to address is this idea of bounded low code, no code. So this is a new blip on the radar in this issue. We did have low code, no code in hold on the last issue of the radar. I think we've seen a lot of interest in this topic. We get a lot of queries. I've personally been involved with like Microsoft Power Platform. AWS has its Honeycode. There's a few other systems out there, and there's a lot of interest, and understandably, in this. But we put this in hold on the last issue because I think it reflects our general trepidation about these things. Most of us have been around this industry for quite a while, and we've seen wave after wave of these of tools that supposedly are going to eliminate the need to have or reduce the need for programmers in businesses, and BPM tools, model-driven development, 4GLs. It's been happening for a long time. So we might be bordering on cynical about these tools, having seen them, because they don't have abstraction. They are not easily testable. They don't lend themselves to version control or diffing, which is a key thing that we do with software when we're writing programs. And they don't have very much expressiveness. We can't name things the way that we do when we're writing code in the high-level programming language. But on the other hand, we definitely see the benefits of a quick and easy way to code some kind of behavior that's available to amateurs. It's available to citizen developers. I personally have used if this then that to do some home automation, and that's a really nice, for really simple things, that's a really nice platform. So it's a more nuanced discussion than that these tools are bad everywhere. And I understand the frustration of CIOs who they have to, how many times have we heard the story where you have to spend millions of dollars to change the color of a button on a website or something like that? Easy things sometimes become very difficult when you have to hire a lot of programmers to do it. And that's an indictment, and I'll have more to say about that later. That's an indictment kind of our industry. Even the meeting we ran to do this, we've had to do these radar meetings online for the last two issues. And we use Excel. It's central to our work, and we've been able to work pretty effectively using a shared Excel spreadsheet. It's well, it's not Excel. We use Google Sheets, but nonetheless, it's a spreadsheet that it's the world's oldest and most widely used low-code environment. But the trick is in keeping these things within their box. So this idea of bounded low-code, no-code says, oh, it's fair enough to want to use these tools when that's a very simple task, when it's something that's very constrained, that's perhaps a proof of concept, or it's something that you just need to get done really quickly. It's not going to be used by a lot of people. They're great tools to use. But the trick is in knowing when to stop and knowing when we've reached a level of complexity. In the case of our spreadsheet, it's pretty complex now. And if we want to add anything to it or change it, we probably are going to have to go back and write an application to support the voting and collaboration that we do. And what my colleagues wrote, he says, low-code, no-code platforms are like Japanese knotweed, that if they escape their box, they entangle everything around them. And that's the experience that we've seen, for 20 years in the business. That's what we see happening. So be careful with these tools. They're sharp. The next slide. Next blip I wanted to talk about is this idea that I'm really excited about, and is the idea of decentralized identity. The internet for years has been kind of inexorably moving us towards decentralized solutions. So microservices, the cloud, all of these technologies enable us to build and collaborative applications that allow us to collaborate and to remove the centralized control. We kind of think of the traditional centralized control as being a mainframe, right? That controls everything in the business. And we've moved largely away from that, and everywhere except identity. And in identity, we still are dependent on these large centralized providers for identity to a large extent. And we're used to the idea that we delegate custodianship of our identity to a large traditional trusted authority. And that's kind of the norm for us. And that's fine until you no longer trust that custodian, until you want to take your identity back from that custodian. And then it becomes very difficult. Suppose you want to just revoke some claim, some privilege that you've allowed your identity to be used for, some consent that you've given, and you'd like to revoke that. That becomes very difficult. And I've seen lots of situations where people try to revoke their consent and then the data stays in the system and whatever. And you're tied to that identity provider forever. Certainly this is improved with federated identity systems. And so now we have a choice of a network of large providers. Often we can choose, but it's still a fixed network. It's still a fixed network of providers. But fortunately, there's a whole new thinking. There's a lot of new thinking out there, and there are some new W3C standards that allow us to break free of this. So things like decentralized identifiers, and they allow us to have an identity that's associated with us for our lifetime, that's portable between providers, and it allows us to decouple our identity and control over identity from those large centralized providers. And this idea of, there's also the idea of verifiable credentials. So a standard for verifiable credentials that lets you say that lets you electronically specify a driver's license or a graduation diploma, something like that, and attach it to that decentralized identity so that you can communicate these things all over IP. And that's this is, I think, a move in the right direction. And the idea is that this identity is self-sovereign. It means you have complete control over that identity and who sees what within it. You can release only as much information about your identity as you want, and you can instantaneously revoke that. So this is, I think, this allows us to get a lot more control over our experience. It gives us a lot more control over identities, and it's going to enable things like open banking, where we have perhaps bank accounts that are portable, our identity and our consent also needs to be portable across these systems. I think this is still in the planning stages. It's still in the proposal stages. There's a few systems out there, but and I don't think the commercial interests are going to give up their ownership of our identities without a fight. So I think it's going to be a while before we actually see this in wide usage, but I think it's a step in the right direction for people having control over their own technology and over their own identities. The next slide.
Sorry, we just have one question on the decentralized identity concept from Amit.
Sure.
Is the recommendation to build or develop identity management with every application and reinvent the wheel?
Well, as you can see, we've got this flip in the assess rate. So what we say, so in the rings, what we say with assess is it's something you need to explore, understand, perhaps experiment with, and be ready to move. It's not, we haven't used it in production. We don't necessarily advise that you move ahead and standardize on this in any way, but it's something that we think everybody should be exploring and understanding and looking at who are the providers of these decentralized identities, what are the various networks that exist, and how would you accommodate it? I'm really interested in seeing how, I don't think we know yet exactly who is going to be accepting these, but I think we need to keep an eye. It's something we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, cool, thanks, Scott. And also there's another question around that, do we have any kind of time frame or opinion on public trust in the decentralized identity concept?
Yeah, I think we're talking potentially years away.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's pretty hard to tell. Okay, I think we can move on. Do you have, maybe we do have time for one more question. What are the cloud providers available today for decentralized identity? And are there Thoughtworks recommended ones that we can assess?
It's something we're actively exploring right now. The one that I'm familiar with is the Sovereign Network. It happens to be an Australian company that uses a distributed ledger technology to encode your self-sovereign identities. So that's one that I happen to be familiar with. Sovereign, S-O-V-R-N, I think but there are several others out there. They don't all use distributed ledgers, so I think it's worth looking into. Okay, so next topic, next blip is something on hold. So hold, what we use a hold ring for, officially it's proceed with caution, but we often use a hold ring to put things that we see that concern us, things that we think you should potentially stop doing or minimize within your organization. And one of those things is productionizing computational notebooks. So computational notebooks, things like Jupyter, that are the kind of the tool of choice for data scientists. So they're really great way to experiment and explore data. They're nice, convenient, interactive programming environment. And you can intersperse text and graphics with the code, and it's a very intuitive way. And you can even share these notebooks with other people by sharing the file. But the very worrying trend that we've seen is that people are putting these things into production. So, and there's even vendors that will help you do that. I mean, it's a natural, I suppose, it's a natural impulse that we have something that works that we like, we want to share with others. So let's make a business application out of it. Let's take this dashboard or panel, this analytics, business analytics data, and make it available to everybody that we've got in the notebook. And it's an appealing notion, but there's some real problems with that. So there are no testing tools for these notebooks. It's not easy to debug them. So sifting through the notebook and find it, they certainly are not scalable, which is done by sharing files. Although I know that there's tools like Jupyter Hub that allow you to have a server-based collaboration. And there's no logging, monitoring, all the operational things that you need in production to be able to really support a multi-user environment. And they don't play well with pipelines, with deployment pipelines. They're great to use for exploring data, but we think people should resist the temptation to make it into a multi-user business application. If we go on to the next slide. So at least partially in response to this problem, to address this problem, there is a set of tools that we've seen kind of an explosion of, that we have several on the radar, of which Dash is one. So it's this problem that we want a simple way to build a custom application that's scalable, that serves multiple users, to be able to interact with business data, to be able to interact with and visualize business data. So this is something data scientists, they've got some analytics, they want to share it, they want to make it available to the rest of the organization. Dash is a tool that lets you easily and simply get one of these applications up, but do it in a very safe and scalable way. So we've been talking about these kind of tools for quite a while. Shiny was built on R, and I think we talked about that several years ago, but this is now Python has become the tool, the language of choice with data scientists, and Dash integrates very well with the Python environment, although it does work with other languages. It allows, so the Dash applications, it's more than just visualization. It allows the user to interact. So there's interactive controls, and you can so you can select aspects of the data to visualize. There's a number of these tools that we put on the radar. So Streamlit is another one. Bokeh is another one. But Dash is kind of distinguished by having it can produce a web application hosted in Flask that is scalable, deployable to a variety of environments. You can put it in a container and deploy it into a container orchestration environment. And it's very robust, as Flask is tried and true and very robust and productionized. So you can think of these tools as sort of filling a gap between a low-code environment, which like Tableau, which is great for business analytics, but it's rather limited in what it can do in terms of the data analysis. And the other extreme would be a completely custom application, building a completely custom React application. Dash has a lot of React components that you can use, so you can get down and do React programming if you want with Dash, but you're not required to. You can build a very simple application that's interactive really quickly. It is a product of Plotly. It's open source, but there is a commercial entity behind it. They would like to sell you their low-code design tools, deployment tools, and so on. But you don't actually need to use them to use Dash. And we found data scientists are really like this tool. We found I know several people that have been using it and really like it. So just to sum up, I guess, and we have, so every, go on to the next slide, every issue of the radar, we put out, we try to summarize our discussions and a lot of the blips that we've seen over the course of the week that we spend putting this thing together into a set of themes. So these themes sort of, I said, we'll have some questions. I'll get to that in just a second. One of the themes that we noticed, so these blips and many more touched on this theme of the democratizing program. And it's a discussion that we have a lot that's very nuanced, and we have some really diverging views on this idea of whether programming should be democratized, if these tools and techniques, on one hand, we don't know. Do we embrace this? Do we embrace it and encourage it? Or do we warn people away from it because it doesn't lend itself, a lot of these tools don't lend themselves to the engineering practices that we espouse. Because on one hand, we live in a world where software entirely dominates our lives, and it's never been more true than right now, when we're all living and interacting with each other online. So
really, people should have some means of taking control. People should not just be passive consumers of technology and software technology. They should, we would like to see citizens and consumers taking control of their computing environments. But on the other hand, they fall prey to all of these things. You know, that the business, you build an application in Excel, it grows completely beyond the scale that it was originally intended. It's not well tested, it's not scalable, and this gets people into a lot of trouble. But I empathize with businesses that are really having difficulty finding the talent, finding the programmers they need to join the digital revolution, and to be, you know, businesses need to make that leap, and they can't actually hire the people they need to do the programming. So there's a lot of incentive to want to use these tools. And I think particularly with the decentralized identity is an example of how people can take control of their computing environment. By taking control of your identity, it returns a lot of control to the citizen. So that's I don't think we've settled that question yet. We still argue about it a lot. I think we're going to be doing a podcast later in the week with several of us with opposing views on this. But I think it was a subject of a lot of discussion, and I think it's something we should be talking about. And as programmers, we need to think about how we can provide these tools to everybody. That's my segment. Do we want to do questions now?
Yeah, maybe we can do a couple of questions related to the blips that you have. So I think one of the questions was around, you talked about the data, about the notebooks, the use of notebooks in production setting. The question is, what about Databricks notebooks? Should they also be put on hold?
In the sense of proceed with caution. So Databricks notebooks is another example. I was going to mention that. So, you know, I use Google Colab. There are several others besides Jupyter Lab. There are several others, and I guess I'd put them all in the same category. They are great for exploration. They're great for experimentation, but they lack a lot of the ability to integrate them into a data pipeline, into a real machine learning workflow. So this is what we want to see people moving towards, is continuous delivery for machine learning, and being able to version the data, version the models at each step along the way, and have those experiments be repeatable and tracked, and lead to a deployment pipeline so we can keep the models fresh in production.
One more question before we move on. How decentralized concept is implemented in the data domain? Do we have any examples?
That's really, I think we are seeing, I didn't mention it, but one of the topics that we are talking about a lot right now is data mesh. Is the idea that that businesses need to move away from the idea of a centralized data repository and a centralized group that is the custodian of the data for the entire organization. Instead, put custodianship of that data, of different data products, into the hands of the business capabilities and the groups that support the business capabilities in which the data originates, or the ones that need to generate the insights. So much like we talk about platforms and digital platforms and being able to empower the developer experience, the same is true for people who consume data products and expose data products. We want to empower people to expose their own data products safely and consistently, so that they're discoverable and of high quality, but still under control of the people who are closest to the data.
Cool. I hope that answers the question. So I think that's all there is for now. Let's move on to Erik. Thank you so much, Scott.
Yeah, so now for something completely different, more blips from the upcoming radar, but in a very different topic area, as you will discover. The first one I want to talk about is Redux. This is a JavaScript framework, I guess as many of you would know. We first put it on the radar in April 2016 in the trial ring, and we mentioned Flux at the time as an application pattern that really helped to bring forward the way we were writing applications that are running in the web browser. It introduced this flux, the pattern, introduced this idea of one-way binding. We had a departure from the traditional MVC, MVVM patterns, just to see how we could write application in the web browser. It very quickly moved into the adopt ring in November 2016. There's a couple of principles that the designers of Redux had in mind that we found really appealing, and that allowed us to write, and not only us, obviously many people in the industry as well, to write applications in the web browser in a better way. There were three main principles. One was the single source of truth, which is that Redux store, that state was read-only. And of course, then you think, okay, state is of course changing. All the changes need to be made by pure functions. And we really like this. I mean, as you know, probably, Thoughtworks is very big on testing. We like test-driven development. We like testing all things. And what we found is that many parts of the life cycle of state, the dispatching of events, the state transition, and the rendering, in this approach with the flux pattern and Redux as an implementation, was easy to test separately. And of course, if you can test smaller units, you can have more targeted tests that are less brittle and more helpful in the whole. It also, and I've seen this personally working on one large application, it worked really well with micro frontends. It allowed us to actually have multiple frontends that were loaded from different backends, obviously, running separately, but coming together in the browser. And we could share a Redux store there. We had namespaces in that store for the individual micro frontends, but we also could have some, and we did have some shared state. And we also had actions that could be sent across from one of the micro frontends to another in the few cases where that was necessary. So it really all worked very well. We were, of course, quite aware that Dan Abramson, who is one of the co-authors of Redux, in 2016 had already written an article, I think it was on Medium, but I'm not 100% sure. And this article was called, "You Might Not Need Redux." And what Dan said in this article in 2016, that when we put this on adopt, he said people often choose Redux before they need it. And then he later followed that and said, and then the developers frown at the indirection Redux introduced to their code. Remember I said there's the centralized store, but all the changes you make have to be coming through pure functions. And a common complaint also mentioned already in that article is that developers then said, why do I have to change like 3 files to just get a simple feature working? And funnily enough, Dan also showed in this blog post how you could do Redux, basically Redux, without the actual Redux framework. And there's a 40-line of like code snippet in this article that's about 40 lines long that shows you how to do it. But as I said, there are many benefits, and this indirection really helps getting an application more modular, more testable, and more scalable in the sense that you could write more code without impacting each other. Not more scalable and faster, that really is not impacted by this, but more scalable when you're working with large development teams on a big application. So that clearly had its benefits. Over the years, React as a framework also changed. And now we have hooks for a good while already, and they're also traced on the technology radar. Sometimes I get the impression people talk about hooks as if they're a replacement for Redux. That's absolutely not the case. Hooks are really super useful, and they're good if you don't want to have classes for your components. And because of the way they're implemented, they do actually help you with having state management in your components. So there is that connection, but they're not a replacement at all. But what it made possible was, and it has always been an alternative, rather than using something like Redux to have state in the components. That is now today a little bit easier. But what we've also seen, and I've also seen this personally on some projects, with this beautiful approach that Redux pioneered, basically, you still had to do things like fetching data from the server. You still needed to do things that really weren't pure functions. You needed to get data from somewhere, from the backend normally. And then we first saw an approach called Redux Func, and that really, for many people, and I've seen this, ended up in callback hell. Then we got an evolution, if you will, of that, Redux Sagas, which basically provide threads in the browser that, in a nutshell, that listen to the actions that are flying around and then do things in the background to modify the state, the store. But again, you see now you don't have pure functions, you have side effects and so on. So in the end, what many teams found was that while it really proves worthy in large applications, while it has many benefits, it wasn't always the right thing to do. And this is why we have moved Redux now back into trial. It is still super, super useful. I can't stress this often enough, but we don't consider it the sensible default, not the thing that you would first reach to, but we're saying when you're beginning to write a reapplication, consider your alternatives, see what you can do with state in the components, what you can do with using hooks, and all sorts of other mechanisms. And you might still want to use Redux. I mean, especially, for example, when you want to share state between components that are not in a parent-child hierarchy, when they're spread, like when you have business logic and state that is shared across different parts of the application. I don't think anything can really beat Redux. And one thing that I also want to caution against is, it is very easy to say, oh, this is all too complicated, I'm going to do my own. And for some very simple things that actually works quickly. But what I've also seen happen a lot is that people then really get from a simple solution into something complicated very quickly. And I mean, we shouldn't underestimate how well designed the idea and battle tested, if you will, the ideas behind Redux are. So if you find that the simple solution that looked so simple when you started is looking increasingly complex, maybe that is the point where you do want to reach out for Redux after all. And what I've highlighted on this slide here also is number 97 and 94. 94 is something new that we are excited about. Interestingly, as you know, React comes from Facebook. Facebook wrote an internal application, large amounts of data, something with production needed to be displayed. And they also found they needed a different way of state management. And they have made that available as open source in a new framework called Recoil. This only came out in May 2010. It has, I checked it last night, it has 10,000 stars on GitHub already. So there's definitely some intention. There's definitely some interest. It has a different concept. Again, it has Recoil root as a centralized store. It has these atoms that are stored in there. But then we're getting back a little bit more into the traditional territory with binding. So the components re-render automatically when they're subscribed to an atom that changes. What is also interesting though is what Recoil has done is they have done derived state. So they have done pure functions on the other end. Rather than pure functions to change the state, they have pure functions to derive state. So if you may remember this from older UI frameworks before the web, when something changes like a list, you have a derived state that says how many items are in the list. And these selectors can be put in there. So quite interesting. This only came out very recently. It is harvested from existing use inside Facebook. So there is definitely a certain, how should I say, a certain notion that it actually really works. We haven't had any production experience, but we are quite excited about it to see yet another approach of doing state management in the web browser. And then also, as I said very briefly, number 97, Svelt is another framework. It's, if you will, a competitor to React. And what we're seeing here is, in the same way as Flux and now the binding again, went back and forth between different paradigms of actually managing state, Svelt is going back and forth now. With Svelt, we're seeing another approach of how do you actually do web frameworks. So rather than what is now common with the frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue, this virtual DOM and the DOM diffing, they have done a different approach. I don't really have the time to go into it, but basically they are like a compiler. They can insert pieces. They create the JavaScript at build time to surgically, as they call it on their website, surgically change the DOM. So what we're seeing here is experimentation in the state of how you deal with the DOM. So we're seeing now on this radar entries that deal with questioning these seemingly accepted wisdom of you need to use the Flux pattern and you need to have a virtual DOM with new frameworks that are approaching it in a different way. Moving on, I'm running out of time here. We're also seeing movement in the tools quadrant. So testing, as I said, very important. We had Selenium. We had in the November 18 radar in Assess Puppeteer, which was a new testing tool that builds on the Chrome Developer Protocol, or CDP, that is adopted by the browsers, allows you to remote control the browsers even in headless mode, which is invaluable if you look at the performance of your acceptance tests, the suite of tests that you want to drive a browser with. You should never have too many of those anyway, but still, of course, performance is critical. What we're seeing, though, is some of the people behind Puppeteer have moved on to Microsoft, and now they basically apply the learnings that they had from Puppeteer in this new framework called Playwright, that is also there for browser testing. It allows you to write tests for Chromium, for Firefox, and for WebKit, the 3 main rendering engines. And that is also, I guess, why we are seeing it gained a lot of support, because it does support the different rendering engines in the browsers. We'll see how quickly that catches up, and we'll see quickly we see how CDP, the Chromium development platform, actually gets adopted. What we're seeing also in this space is, like with the browser testing, there's all these little things, and for example, I just mentioned that you have to cater for the 3 browser engines. People use polyfills a bit, and this is not highlighted on the screenshot you can see, but there's another thing on the edition of the TechWare that's coming out, where we're saying, actually, you have this idea of polyfills that allows you to actually target all the browsers, even if they don't have some of the features, like with the testing now. But now we're actually saying you can tailor them to the browsers. You don't have to download kilobytes of code that is targeted at, say, something like an older browser, like Internet Explorer, and ship that down to Chromium running on a mobile phone. You don't have to do this. So we see, again, some fine-tuning around there. Similar things which we will highlight on the radar, something around web components. They're also still around. There's still things happening around web components. But let's move on to another entry that is on the radar, mock service workers. So again, here we're seeing more tools, or this is actually a framework for testing. We oftentimes these days have applications that half of it roughly is running in the web browser, the other half is running on the server. Again, ideally, you want to test them separately. That seam that you have at the network level is a good way of separating, testing those pieces individually. We've had tools like Mountebank and so on that allowed us to stub the traffic that was coming from the front end at the network level. This is still a good thing. We should still have some tests that test at the network level, but maybe the bulk of the tests don't have to go through the network level, and we can increase the speed by actually capturing the requests inside the web browser. And this is exactly what mock service workers does. It captures the events to fetch data and send it back to the JavaScript application at the service worker level, which is very well supported by tools. Developers are familiar with it. The browsers support this in a very good way. So this, in our experience, is something where you can intercept this and test the front end without having the back end. In automated tests, this is where you really want to use that. And then, last but not least, something different, where we're seeing also what I've talked about so far was, how do we deal with the web browser? What do we do with the traditional applications? With Blazor, we have an approach that I guess many of us haven't really seen live. In 2018, we featured WebAssembly on the Tech Radar. WebAssembly is a W3C standard, and it allows us to run applications in languages other than JavaScript. It uses the same sandbox as JavaScript, but initially, for example, it used LLVM, which is the low-level virtual machine, as a target. So languages like C, C++, but also Rust and even Swift, they could create code that would run natively in the web browser, not being transpiled into JavaScript. The browser really downloads this WebAssembly and executes it. That makes it really quite faster than downloading JavaScript. Firefox, for example, has a streaming compiler. It can compile faster than it downloads the data from the web. And it even has a background thread that can then optimize the code. So it first compiles something quickly, so the application starts, and then when the background compilation has happened, more optimized code is swapped in on the fly. The promise was always there in 2018. What we're seeing now is Blazor, the framework, open sourced. It's a framework for Microsoft. It's part of the ASP.NET. If you know this, this has been around for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, maybe even. The framework that Microsoft uses in the Microsoft world to write web applications, also server-side rendering. They came out pretty much with WebAssembly, but 2 years on, what we're seeing is that this is now really becoming a very viable platform to write web applications. Ironically, all the modern browsers are supported except Internet Explorer, purely because Internet Explorer does not support WebAssembly. They've also come out with something to do PWAs, progressive web applications, with offline mode. But what was really worth highlighting once again is you write, as you've guessed, C# code that is running in the web browser on top of WebAssembly. So you can leverage all the .NET standard runtime. All of this is downloaded, is compiled on the fly very quickly, and you can really write an application as you would write an application in C# normally. I mean, you still use, of course, HTML and CSS, What we find particularly interesting, though, is that now with this, it's basically just a new programming language, but we're seeing again some of the ecosystem of Microsoft coming in here. Lots of companies writing component UI frameworks like these grids and so on that we saw on the desktop, we see here too. We also, coming back to what I talked about initially with Redux, we are now seeing people to experiment again with the MVVM pattern, the model view model pattern that was always popular in the .NET world. And we're seeing people experiment with that in the web browser. And all of this in the end, and there were more, I really had to make some selections here for this presentation. All of this led us to a theme, and we had multiple ways of looking at it. But in the end, we decided to call it "The Struggle with the Browser Continues." And I think you can switch to that now. Okay. And what we wanted to express here is that the web browser ultimately, when it was created, was meant not really as an application runtime, not as a platform to write applications in. And yet we've done this successfully since basically Ajax was introduced. We've written applications where most of the code is running independently in JavaScript in the browser and that asynchronously requests some data. So we've used the browser for a long time now as an application runtime. But what we're seeing, even a decade or more into this, some of the basic questions are still not settled. Are we using flux pattern? Are we using something different? How do we manage state? Which framework are we using? Are we using VDOM? Are we changing this during the build time? We're still experimenting, and what we believe is that there is a lot of innovation, and it is a capable platform, but it is a platform that really shows through its ages that it really wasn't meant to do this, and yet we have somehow succeeded in using it as an application platform. And that is what I wanted to say about this. I don't know whether we have time to answer questions. I guess we do.
Cool. I think we can take a couple of questions. So first question is around, this is a question for Erik. Is sharing React Store amongst different micro front ends a valid pattern?
Well, I mean, what can I say? In my experience, it worked very well. The key thing that is important to remember is you can namespace that. The Redux store, in the end, are just JavaScript objects. And what you can do at the top level, if you have 15, that's probably too large a number. Let's say you have 5 micro frontends. And the first one is called A, the second one is called B. What you can do is at the top level in the Redux store, you just have an entry called A, and all the state for micro frontend A lives under that. So it will only manipulate the state that is underneath its own thing. So you can easily isolate them. What you can then do is carefully, when these individual micro frontends need to change or exchange or share state inside the web browser, this is a topic for an entire talk really, but if they need to do this, you can have a shared section in that Redux store. Make it very explicit, call it shared or something else at the top level. But remember, this is now becoming a contract between your 2 different micro frontends, and you have to treat it like a contract. You probably want to write some tests against it. And again, if you have a contract between 2 micro frontends, that means if you change the contract, you have to synchronize between them, as in the development teams need to agree you want to change the contract. So that is again reducing the independence. So you can do it, but the easiest way to do it at the top level is to just namespace it by putting all the state under a key at the top level.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Erik. All right, next question. I think this is a question around the radar itself. We always have the least number of technologies in the hold ring. I realize that both technology and tool sections for your radar also does not have anything in hold. How do we know that the numbers are right in hold? Is it the trend, or people just did not consider them as they are hold? I take this question to mean, how do we know that the numbers are right? Is it the trend of people?
If the little dots don't fill up the sector in the circle, then we know we've got the numbers right. That was a flippant answer. We're much more careful about the things we put in hold, I think. And like Rebecca, in particular, our CTO, Rebecca Parsons, who runs this whole operation, is very she wants to kind of sign off on everything that goes in hold, because it's a little riskier for us to put a stake in the ground and say you should not do this, or you should potentially even remove these things from your environment. And we don't want to be disparaging. We always look for ways, whenever we put something in hold, and Erik could back me up on this, I hope, that we always try to think of a way that we could instead express it in a positive sense. Hold's kind of the last resort for us. So if there's nothing in hold, we don't stress about that if they're in a particular quarter.
I mean, to give you an example, also in 2016, when we had some experience with microservices, we realized that people were writing microservices on the server side. They split their code into individual deployable units, but still wrote one big JavaScript application in the browser. And people called this the front-end monolith. And this was a terrible thing to do. And we had these discussions, and Scott was in that discussion too. Should we put the front-end monolith on hold? And instead, what we said is, no, let's give a more constructive answer and say, what would we do instead? And this is actually when we put the word micro front ends on the tech radar and coined this as a pattern that is now alive and well. So again, the idea is to avoid as much as possible hold and offer constructive, positive entries instead. So in a way, we've done our job well if there's little in hold. But sometimes there are these things, and you'll see them through the years, and maybe also on this radar, they're just things out there in the industry that really don't work well. And then there sometimes is no good answer, and we just say, don't do this, or be extremely careful with those.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both Erik and Scott. I think we can move on to the next section. So just closing off now is that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Also, thank you, special thanks to Scott and Erik for giving us an overview of the potential, the upcoming for the next technology radar volume 23. Please keep an eye out for it from everybody. You can have you can play around with the radar when it comes out on our Thoughtworks website as well. So yes, and also you can build your own radar. There's some tools on our website for you to do so too. So yeah, please keep an eye out. So thank you everybody for attending the session today.